Second word, culture. If I were to ask you to define culture, how would you define it? How would you define it to a friend? How would you define it in a research paper or maybe on the job if you were doing some applied anthropology? What would you say culture is? It's a really important concept, but we don't always define it carefully. Well, I think there are many good ways to define it. I'll give you a chance to pause the video if you'd like to and write down your definition. But the way that I want to define it, and I think will work for our purposes, although again, I would stress that there are many definitions that circle around similar themes, but the way I think of it is that culture is things that are shared and learned within social groups, right? Shared and learned. We pick them up by being part of a group. We learn them. They're not just instinctual, and they are shared among the group, at least partially. And they're shared and learned ways of thinking, communicating, and acting. They cover how our values, our worldview, what we think the world is composed of. They cover how we talk or sign or write or otherwise communicate, the art we produce, and the ways that we behave. They cover things like whether we believe in a concept of dream time or the dreaming, as many Aboriginal Australians traditionally do, and also cover things like the fact that when we put out our hands to each other, we're going to shake hands to acknowledge our shared humanity and that we're in a semi-friendly space as opposed to trying to karate chop each other. So generally speaking, we can think of culture as that. It covers everything from how we show status, for example, if we do that through, as Easter Islanders traditionally did many centuries ago, through the moai, through large stone heads that were associated with specific elites and their lineages, or whether we do that with something like a specific kind of uniform. This happens to be Eric Wolf here in military uniform. He served in the US Army in World War II, or whether through saffron robes and other types of robes in the case of Theravada Buddhist monks, such as this monk who is ordaining a tree in the famous book. I think this is a picture from the famous book, Ordaining the Tree by Sue Darlington. So culture covers things like that, how we dress, and that tends to be kind of one of the first things that people think. If you go on Google image and try to like say like, oh, culture, and if you come across like a business website talking about cultures, they often will equate it to that, right? Or at least show pictures of that, different forms of dress. But it's a lot more than that, right? It's also such stuff as deep as how we relate to the planet, whether or not we think it's appropriate, for example, to do hydraulic fracturing, as in this picture on the center at the very bottom, which is a type of way of getting natural gas out of the ground, which was very prevalent where I used to live in Denton, Texas, which involves injecting a proprietary blend of liquids at a very fast or very concussive force down into the ground, and is associated with a variety of potential impacts, but allows you to make use of natural gas that would otherwise be inaccessible. Even when cultures say that it is critical to value the environment, the way they express that can be very different. So for example, ordaining a tree, because to do so is symbolic of the fact that living beings suffer from rapid deforestation in Thailand, as in the case of the environmental monks, which started out somewhat controversial, and especially because people took the ordaining of a tree to be literal, not metaphorical. So that's one way of expressing reverence for nature. Another is the idea within certain Peruvian indigenous peoples and other South American indigenous peoples of Inti, of a sun deity, or whether it be ideas of, for example, Altanan, true believers, and the ideas of Kunkta Jela, and a mother of spirits, animals that we properly dispose of dead animals, and that helps send a message of respect that then is reciprocated with animals continuing to come to our village, as in certain traditional Dena'ina stories. So as you can see, 3 different ways of expressing respect for nature, but 3 very different sort of idioms or stories that go with that. Culture even covers such seemingly mundane things as whether we eat from one plate or many, as in a great reading by Laura DeLuca, Why Don't Westerners Eat Off One Plate, where the interlocutors that she was spending time with, the Hadzabe people in Tanzania, were surprised that her students would always go into their own tents to eat food, and thought that meant that they did not like each other. And so culture even extends to things like that, right? One group of people perceives that as just having a little downtime. Another group perceives it as being fundamentally antisocial. So culture covers a great many things. It is also essentially Homo sapiens cheat code, by which I mean this rather pathetic being that you see in the left-hand picture, crunched over with the awkward back. That's a symptom of how the human body is, how the human body functions and is shaped. This human being with the, not very large claws, pretty unimpressive canine teeth, good eyesight, good ability to long distance run, but, not, somewhat impressive, but not the most impressive animal in the animal kingdom. Certainly not this bizarre specimen. Anyways, that animal has somehow spread across the entire world, even into Antarctica. And it's in large part because of culture, something that allows us to continually reinvent our niche so that the same exact species can be both village dwelling salmon, beluga, caribou hunters, and berry foragers, among other things, up here in Tikatnu Cook Inlet area, or be flood rice agriculturalists in certain parts of Southeast Asia, or be highland farmers in the case of some parts of the Swiss Alps, or be cattle pastoralists among the Maasai of East Africa, or be hunter-gatherers, as with the Hadza of Tanzania, and the Aceh of the Amazonian rainforest, right? We've exploded into so many different niches. I would argue more niches or ecological roles than any other species on this planet, in large part because culture allows us to continually redefine ourselves. Yet for all its powers, for all its magnificence and complexity and terribleness sometimes, culture is also contested. I have here a picture of soccer because when I was a kid, soccer was certainly getting more popular in the United States, but soccer has never quite had the prominence of football or basketball, unlike in many European countries, Latin American countries, and indeed much of the rest of the world. But soccer has slowly crept up on these other sports, right? And is a sign of change in the United States, including changing demographics as we have more migrants, for example, from Latin America, but also just changing conceptions of what a proper American sport is. By the way, it's also worth noting that we call it soccer, even though the name in many other places is football or football. Also an example of how culture changes as it moves into new groups of people. So culture is contested, it changes over time. It's also complicated, right? With the example of soccer, some Americans love soccer, some hate it, and some would think it's not a very American sounding sport. It's something that people do in other countries. So it's complicated, right? Not every person agrees on everything but there can still be a culture, there can still be a lot of continuity, still be a lot of shared ways of thinking and acting, even when we disagree on issues as profound as soccer, or perhaps much more profound than soccer, such as who should lead the country. And then culture is contested, right? Culture is contested, by which I mean people disagree and debate. This also kind of highlights the fact that culture is a verb as much as it is a noun. And what I mean by that is that we sometimes speak of it, especially early anthropologists spoke of it as more of like a noun, something that people have. And that's the way many people still speak of it in kind of everyday conversation. Again, if you were to go to like a culture training at a workplace, they might talk about people having culture. And there's truth to that. You have a set of practices, you have a way of speaking that you to some degree carry around in that brain of yours. But we might also think of culture as much as a noun. We might also think of it as a verb, as something we do and take part in. It's a little bit less like a game of soccer where we're all following a specific set of rules, and a little bit more like when kids play superheroes on the playground. I'm thinking of this because I have small children, a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old. But anyways, when they play games like that, there's broad rules, but they're also often disagreeing about what the rules. No fair, you can't do that, right? Culture's a little like that. We are both follow along in its stream, but also we redefine its boundaries over time to some degree. It's a game we both take part in and modify, sometimes a very serious game. And finally, a final note on how we'll be using the term culture in this course is that no culture is isolated or unchanging. So when you think about tourism and land and culture, one of the points that many people brought up, and indeed many of you brought this up in your response, is what effect does tourism have on people's cultures? And many of you, I was really happy to see, brought up really cool points about like it's a complicated relationship, because it is a complicated relationship, because tourism no doubt changes things, right? We'll talk about that in a minute. But also culture has always been changing to some degree, right? We should not expect cultures to be isolated. I don't think I can think of a single culture on Earth that is truly fully isolated. Sometimes there are claims that such and such culture is, but they almost never turn out to be true. Even some of our seemingly most remote cultures within the deep rainforest, for example, are indeed interacting with and trading with other groups, sometimes across vast distances, and being affected by others' ideas and others' languages. So we've never been isolated. What's changed in the last couple hundred years with tourism, but also with global trade and a million other things, is the speed and the scope of that interaction, right? People now interacting across huge distances very quickly. The other thing, though, is not only are cultures never isolated, but partly for that reason, and partly because human beings have agency or free will, cultures are not unchanging, and they never have been, right? My ancestors, and perhaps many of yours, part of the way they got to where they ended up in the United States was traveling in sailboats from Europe, and then at some point hopping inside these covered wagon thingies and move into the Western United States. When I go down to the grocery store, I don't hop inside a covered wagon. I suspect you don't either. That doesn't mean that I'm not still profoundly affected by the values and ideas of my ancestors, and everything from the language I speak, English, to the name that I have, Adam Dunstan, which is a thoroughly English name. Well, actually, Adam's a Hebrew name, but we'll get there another day. And to the kind of overall worldview that I have, right? Those have all been shaped by my ancestors. And yet, I drive a different thing, I wear a different thing, and I like to think that perhaps I've abandoned some of that and, my parents' generations and so forth have abandoned perhaps some of the prejudices that early ancestors had. So culture is not an unchanging thing. Most of us don't wear sort of powdered wigs like George Washington, unless you're a British judge nowadays, but they're just wacky. Just kidding. You're not allowed to say that stuff as an anthropologist. Anyways, generally speaking, we don't wear powdered wigs. But as Americans, we are very much recipients of the ideas of not Republican, like GOP, sorry, Republic forms of democracy, representative forms of democracy that George Washington and many others helped to sort of pioneer. So that culture has continued even if it's changed. So this is all helpful to have a clear understanding of land and culture and their profound powers, because those will both be very much recurring themes in this course. And now I'd like to move into word number 3, which is tourism.